Good evening, everyone. Thank you very, very much for joining us. I think most people know who I am, but for those of you who don't, I'm Jean Bou. I'm a lecturer in Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, and along with my co-conspirator over there, I organise these seminars. I've lost track of what number this is, but this is our, I think, around about nearly our 50th War Studies seminar. So we've been going for quite a few years now after a bit of a COVID break last year. Tonight's speaker is Emily Robertson. She's going to be talking to you about some of the complexities around propaganda in the Second World War, and the main complexity being the Japanese holding large numbers of Australians prisoner after the fall of Singapore and other events in Southeast Asia in late 1941, early 1942. Emily completed a PhD in history at the UNSW Canberra, well, that's ADFA to many of us, looking at propaganda in the First World War. Emily's a bit of a fixture in the teaching circles, both at ADFA and here as well. Please join me in welcoming her to the lectern.
I'd like to just start by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank Jean for getting me to come in and do this talk. It's the first time I've gotten back into my research in 2 years, so it's been really fun to get back into the archives. And one more thing before I start my talk properly is I'm just going to state that I'll be using some terms that are very offensive today, and the main one is Jap, and this was used in propaganda campaigns. So obviously my use of this term is not saying it's an acceptable term, but this is how it was used in the period. Okay, this talk has a somewhat broad remit. While the overall theme is exploring how public knowledge of atrocities against POWs in Japanese camps was dealt with by the Australian government during World War II, it will cover a range of different aspects that relate to this issue. I'll be discussing the censorship of Japanese atrocities in the media, the very public rejection of an Australian anti-Japanese propaganda campaign in 1942, and the reason why Australia did not, despite having heartily embraced anti-German atrocity propaganda in World War I, produce an atrocity propaganda campaign about Australian prisoners of the Japanese in World War II. So the research question uniting this material is, why didn't the Australian government exploit POWs of the Japanese for propaganda purposes during the war? Because of the inter-allied nature of how material was released and approached, this question can only be answered by also discussing how the British and the United States handled this issue. In particular, I will be looking at the British and Australian material, as I was fortunate enough to visit the archives in London before the outbreak of COVID. So material relating to the United States is either from the National Archives in Britain or Australia. So one reason why the lack of exploitation of Japanese atrocities is significant is that atrocities were a central pillar of World War I propaganda. Produced both officially and unofficially, the number of publications focused on this topic of the bestial Boche ranges into the hundreds in Australia alone. German atrocities in France, and particularly Belgium, provided a just war rationale throughout Australian society, and prisoners of war assumed, oopsie, I've gone off the wrong page. See, I haven't talked for ages. They provided just war rationale for the Allies throughout the Great War, and it was also reasonably successful until the close of the war, the final year of the conflict, in actually promoting the war. In contrast, World War II Australian propaganda did not exploit information either about German atrocities against the Jews or Japanese atrocities against civilians and Allied soldiers in the Asia Pacific. And in a couple of notable cases where propagandists did apply the dehumanising racist tropes against the Japanese, there was sometimes a strong negative public reaction. This is not to say that racist anti-Japanese caricatures were not published in Australia or were completely unpopular. However, what is significant is that some fear-based campaigns about the Japanese attracted a significant number of vocal critics, with detractors finding the material either chauvinistic or defeatist. Alongside the rejection of some anti-Japanese propaganda was the absence of news about Australian POWs in Japanese camps south of Hong Kong. The lack of propaganda about Japanese atrocities, coupled with the public rejection of some anti-Japanese propaganda until nearly the end of the conflict, may come as a surprise. It was in fact not until towards the end of the war that the floodgates opened and the Australian media began to publish atrocity stories in earnest. The stories and images of Japanese atrocities continue to play a significant role in how Australians remember World War II. Of the photographs of Australian soldiers who have been brutalised, Robin Gersten has stated, a range of continually reproduced iconic images of Australian virtuosity and Japanese turpitude has come to mean the war. And the scale of deaths, as most of us in this room or who are watching online would know, the scale of deaths was incredible. Approximately 35% of Australians who were captured died. As Joan Beaumont has written, the impact of captivity was felt throughout Australian society, and prisoners of war assumed a central place in national memory of World War II. But for the majority of the Pacific War itself, the captured men were a source of mystery and silence. This was partly due to the refusal by the Japanese to provide nominal rolls of captured units. However, some of the silence was also a deliberate strategic decision by the Australian government. Picking up on Joan Beaumont's book chapter titled The Long Silence about what was known by authorities about Australian POWs in the Asia Pacific, I'll be further exploring why this topic was essentially taboo in Australia during much of the war. The silence about Japanese atrocities was not just due to a lack of knowledge. There was also a furious but quiet war underway within the Australian information warfare bureaucracy to keep up morale through quashing stories, both authenticated and authenticated, about atrocities against Australian soldiers. This campaign to keep morale afloat was also pursued by members of the Australian public, some of whom wrote to the censors to complain whenever an atrocity story slipped through the net. It was therefore censorship from below as well as from above. So, talking about what was actually known, no significant official information was released to the public until January 1944, when British Foreign Minister Anthony Eden delivered a speech about Allied POW conditions in the House of Commons. And this public statement only occurred because the US had, against the wishes of Dominion and UK governments, published atrocity stories about Allied POWs, leaving the British government no choice but to state publicly what it knew. Eden's speech was, of course, also widely reported in the Australian media. However, official detailed information about the extent of the war crimes committed against Australians was not made publicly available until the Webb report, which was an exhaustive legal investigation of Japanese war crimes allegations, was released in full after the close of hostilities in September 1945. Indeed, not only were the results of the report deliberately held back until the end of the war, the fact the report had even been commissioned was not publicly announced until November 1944. This stands in stark contrast to how enemy atrocities were exploited in World War I. The British investigation of German war crimes in Belgium, the Bryce report, was published in early 1915 and formed a central platform of British and Australian anti-German propaganda. This dynamic between the people and the government in the Second World War makes for an interesting study of the psychological element of strategy that also constitutes a major part of total war. Propaganda, when combined with censorship, aims to shape the overall flow of publicly available information into a form that aids the war effort by stimulating morale. As Colin Gray has argued, and I'm sure a lot of people who read about strategy have heard this a few times, strategy is the bridge between military purpose and political power. I contend that information warfare is one of the key components of how that bridge is constructed. It is an intrinsic part of the Clausewitzian trinity, that of the people, of passion and hatred and enmity. And when directed carefully, it can support the war effort. When managed poorly, it can undermine the will to fight. Stirring up the passions of the people is a hallmark of many wars of the 20th century, driven by mass media and the need to mobilise democratised countries. Yet overselling the evil nature of the enemy can have very negative consequences. In 1942, remembering the egregious anti-German campaigns of the previous war, the censors were a little more inclined to caution. Australian censor Colonel Dillon opined to another Australian censor, while you can't win wars without hate, there was a danger that atrocity stories would be interpreted as unreal and thus unbelievable horror stories, which might lead people to dismiss the stories as fabrications. In addition, Australian censors were concerned that publishing gruesome details about the treatment of Australian soldiers by the Japanese would have, and I quote, a negative effect on public morale. Silence was, in this case, considered the better part of valour. This is one of the most lurid images I have of First World War atrocity propaganda, just to give you an example of the difference. Overall, the Second World War saw a very different treatment of enemy atrocities, both German and Japanese. One reason was the backlash against atrocity propaganda from the Great War. The exaggerated nature of atrocity propaganda from the previous war had led to deep scepticism about the reports regarding both atrocities against the Jews and Australian POWs. In 1944, the West Australian Worker wrote, "After the revelations of the devilish ingenuity of the propaganda machines of the various nations in the last war in inventing atrocity stories, many people made a vow that never again would they allow themselves to be deceived in this way." When authenticated stories of Japanese atrocities had been released to the public, sometimes they were met with great scepticism. One journalist stated, I quote, "As has been proved in the past, the stories were purely the product of a vivid imagination and the urge to get a story at all costs." The West Australian noted in 1942, "Almost every Australian is unwilling to believe the horror stories that follows almost every Japanese invasion." This scepticism was also an issue in Great Britain, from where the original Great War atrocity stories had emanated. In early 1944, a Whitehall bureaucrat noted that it would be difficult to get the British to even entertain the allegations of atrocities may be true, writing, "The much more serious difficulty in this country seems to me to be the inherent scepticism in some quarters regarding any atrocity story." As Britain and Australia had shared much of the interwar literature debunking, and ironically, actually sometimes falsely debunking allegations of German atrocities in World War I, both countries faced similar challenges in how to communicate stories of atrocities without sounding like they were playing from the Great War atrocity playbook again. The United States too had a shared background with the shadow of atrocity propaganda from the previous war, casting doubts on announcements about Japanese atrocities. In a press release produced after Japanese surrender, the US government announced it had not been in a position to release much information about the POWs and civilian internees during the war because publicity about conditions in camps and Japanese atrocities had always been quickly and effectively dismissed by the Japanese government as mere atrocity campaigns. And this brings me to the way that the backlash against the First World War was also used by the Japanese and the Germans to silence any stories about atrocities. So the atrocity propaganda had been such an effective weapon against the German enemy in World War I, had become a weapon used by the Axis against the Allies in World War II. Goebbels very deliberately drew attention to the exaggerated aspects of anti-German propaganda of the previous war whenever allegations of mistreatment of Jews arose in the press. This was one factor that made campaigns about enemy atrocities, Japanese or German, very difficult to execute. So this brings me to the campaign known as the Jap as he really is. The only atrocity propaganda campaign launched by the Australians was about Japanese atrocities against British and Chinese people. For the purposes of this paper, the campaign will be titled The Jap as he really is. In her examination of the campaign, historian Kay Saunders treats the rejection of the campaign by quite a few members of the public as a surprising outlier, indeed an inexplicable one. She writes, "What is extraordinary that these broadcasts mirrored public opinion of long-standing duration is that any criticism emerged. However, given the powerful backlash against Great War atrocity propaganda that had built within Allied countries during the interwar years, it was perhaps inevitable that it would be difficult to sell a campaign decrying the complete savagery and inhumanity of the Japanese as a race. The terms used in the 1942 campaign, barbarism, savagery, inhumanity, have been terms that have been used endlessly and recycled about the Germans in the previous war. And among some contemporary commentators, the intolerance of Great War atrocity propaganda had informed the dynamics that had led to the Treaty of Versailles, which in turn had laid the foundations for the current war. I'm not arguing this is the case, by the way. I'm merely reporting the views of some critics at the time. The tired knowledge of the propaganda tricks played by governments during wartime, coupled with an awareness of Hitler's blaring mode of intolerance and propaganda, made delivering a successful anti-Japanese publicity campaign a very complex proposition. So on the 30th of March 1942, the Australian government launched the Jap as he really is campaign, which was a subset of the broader Know Your Enemy campaign. The campaign itself was very much in the mould of previous Great War campaigns. Expert opinion was melded with lurid language and a lecturing tone to promote hatred of the enemy. It consisted of newspaper articles, a series of posters, pamphlets and radio broadcasts on the ABC. So it was very, very well funded and very organised and distributed widely across Australia. Significantly, the campaign was released not too long after the bombing of Darwin and the fall of Singapore, which may also have had a bearing upon how it was publicly received. While anti-Japanese propaganda formed in the mould of World War I, anti-German propaganda was not necessarily taboo in the way that reportage of Japanese atrocities was, it certainly did not receive a universally enthusiastic welcome. As historian Peter Dennis has written of the campaign, during the war, racial stereotypes were used to engender popular feeling against not only the Japanese military, but the Japanese people as a whole. He adds, however, that there were limits beyond which the community would not go. The campaign covered, amongst other things, Japanese atrocities in Hong Kong, Manchuria, and Japanese militarism. In the radio broadcast, the Japanese were described as barbarians, and when discussing the myth of Bushido, the spectre of the savage, which was also a term frequently levelled against Germans in World War I, was also used. The script for the broadcast stated, "In Nanking, we see the apostles of Bushido killing the defenceless with the insensate brutality of the savage." Finally, as with propaganda about the German foe of the Great War, the broadcast stated that civilization would prevail over this inhuman barbaric savage. The series, particularly what became known as the hate broadcasts, drew considerable backlash and was protested by the Bishop and Archbishop of Tasmania, as well as the President of the Free Church Council. Independent New South Wales politician D.P. McDonald led a deputation in response to the Jap as he really is, asking Senator Ashley, who was the Minister for Information at the time, to re-examine the department's propaganda policy and advised him that the advice of people of high attainments in education and psychology should be procured before any further broadcasts were arranged. McDonald stated the broadcasts lacked dignity and decency. Their cheap theatrical tone, their melodramatic denunciations, and their use of abusive epithets and adjectives had been repulsive to thousands of people. And perhaps most significantly, he stated that the campaign would have an adverse effect on public morale. Even Charles Bean, war correspondent and official historian of the Great War, weighed in on the campaign, calling it blundering and an artificial spur to hate. So this is the hate campaign, stupid propaganda, relating to Bean's letter. Bean identified the dehumanising racist element of the campaign, writing that the description of Japanese people as loathsome, creeping creatures contained the far-off echo of Hitler's well-known screech of hate. One journalist echoed Bean's criticism of the language of the campaign, writing, "We have seen and have felt ashamed of the huge advertisements in the daily papers, of which the keynote or slogan recurring in all of them is, 'We have always despised them, now we must smash them.' This refers to the Japanese, and both the statements are lies. Only silly, ignorant fools have ever despised the Japanese, and there is no need to smash them." The radio campaign had gone so far as to state that, I quote, "What we've got to do is to wipe out a race that has been whipped into a fanatical conception of its so-called divine destiny by the relentless propaganda of its leaders." This suggestion of wiping out a race was indeed, as Bean had noted, very close to Hitler's own propaganda messages. A Gallup poll found that 54% of Australians objected to the kind of rhetoric employed in the series. Those who objected to it disliked the theatrical and unreal tone. They also considered it wrong to stir up hatred between nations. Finally, the Gallup poll revealed that those who objected to the campaign felt Australians did not need scaring. Presumably, events of the past few months should prove a sufficient spur to action. One journalist asserted that the details of atrocities in Hong Kong was justified only if the nation were wholly unconcerned at the approach of the enemy. The Australian people need no such urge to stern resistance to the threatened invasion of their country. There was also concern that the demonising of the Japanese was counterproductive in terms of mobilisation for the war. Sorry, John, I'm using mobilisation in a different way. One poster from an earlier part of the federal campaign, "He's Coming South," attracted the ire of state politicians who felt the sentiment was demoralising rather than invigorating. The acting Queensland Premier, Walter Cooper, branded it as a fear poster, and along with 3 other state leaders threatened to ban its distribution in his state. The Sydney Morning Herald backed up Cooper's criticism of the poster, stating that it encouraged the retreatism that has been the bane of the Allied campaign in the Pacific. In the Second World War, the relationship between morale, propaganda and strategy had become highly salient. This was partly due to the impressive and sustained propaganda efforts of the Nazi Party, which had arguably disintegrated the will to resist in the hostile nations and built up a really formidable morale in Germany, military, industrial and civilian. In December 1941, ironically the same month that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, American sociologist Arthur Upham Pope published an academic article in which he asserted that civilian morale is as important as military morale and was crucial to sustaining the national effort required to prosecute a total war. This awareness of the delicate nature of morale and the need for its sustainment permeated the Australian Censor's decisions. In late April 1942, the Censor's Office made the decision to withhold press stories about Japanese atrocities against Australians on the grounds that these stories were prejudicial to security or public morale. There was an important shared factor between the rejection of the propaganda campaign, the Jap as he really is, and the censorship of news stories about Australian POWs imprisoned or captured by the Japanese. And that was a concern that morale would be negatively affected. That is not to say that the Australian government had a particularly functional approach to controlling key messages about the Japanese. What's actually quite fascinating about this case study is that despite the chaotic nature of communication within Australia between the military, the censors and the campaign directors, and also between Australia and its allies on the issue of allied POWs in the Asia Pacific, is that a consistent silence about atrocities was maintained until around the final year of the war. And even when information started to come out, it was tightly controlled until the very end and did not reveal the extent of the issue. One of the key questions occupying the Australian government and also the British government, interestingly enough, was, did atrocity stories about Australian POWs mobilise Australians, or did these stories destroy morale? Demonstrating the interlinked relationship of censorship and propaganda in wartime, the Censor's Office was as concerned with public morale as those who were producing propaganda material. The Office did, however, have an inconsistent view on whether or not the publication of atrocity stories would be beneficial to morale. And this was due to how those within the chain of military command interacted with the media and interacted with the civilian censors. A superficial observation is that those within the military were often more likely to want atrocity stories about Australian soldiers published than the civilian censors were. In early April, a number of Australian newspapers broke the story about the murder of around 50 Australian soldiers who had surrendered after the fall of Rabaul. Despite the sensationalist headlines, this was solid journalism based on eyewitness accounts from 3 survivors. And some might note that the byline of one of the reporters is George Johnston, author of My Brother Jack. This material had been officially verified by intelligence officer of the RWAF, who even inspected the wounds of the soldiers who were providing the testimony in order to authenticate the stories. The thoroughness of the reportage, however, did not protect the stories from strong negative reactions, which were met with disgust and repudiation across Australia. One was a concern about the impact on morale. A newspaper article in a West Australian newspaper stated, "The disgusting description of gruesome and unbelievable details is a dastardly offence against civilian morale, even if, as is stated, it has been officially released." The article also noticed that the details were going to be very upsetting to the relatives of Australian POWs. The Federal Censor's Office was immediately notified in a telegram by the South Australian Censor that the publication of the story was causing much distress here amongst relatives of soldiers known to be in enemy hands, and that the public in general was greatly concerned. He elaborated in a letter sent on the same day, "It is felt here that no useful purpose is being served by the publication in such gruesome detail of these stories." The State Censor's letter was followed by a missive from a citizen in Victoria, R. Carter, who asked that even if the stories of shooting and starvation proved true, would it not be better that the news be sent privately to the relatives of those Australians? The author further asserted that broadcasting such information causes great distress to the relatives, including the mothers and wives of prisoners of war, and should be forbidden by the authorities. On the 23rd of April 1942, a blunt telegram was sent out by the Federal Censor to all state censors. No further atrocity stories may be published, broadcast or cabled. Despite this blanket ban, the Chief Publicity Censor, Edmund Bonney, observed in a letter to another censor that while the stories have caused some distress, they have also served the useful purpose of arousing the public to the realities of a situation that was being rendered more perilous by the prevailing complacency. End of quote. So how could a correct balance be achieved? One answer was to initiate a judicial inquiry headed by Sir William Webb, whose examination of the evidence would ensure that all material released to the public had been fully authenticated. His appointment, however, and the news that an inquiry was being undertaken to investigate Japanese atrocities was kept quiet until 1944. This stopgap solution did not prevent atrocity stories from being pushed through via the military. In October 1943, a story was published about an Australian officer who had been beheaded by the Japanese in New Guinea. The story was described in a letter of complaint to the government by one Australian as ghoulish. It was also condemned in New South Wales Parliament by W.H. Lamb, who demanded to know why the blood-curdling, horrible account of the barbaric decapitation of a young Australian officer by the Japanese had been published, and had they taken into account the nerve-wracking distress that would have been suffered by relatives of boys who were presently fighting in New Guinea. It transpired after some investigation, that the blanket ban of publication of stories about atrocities had been broken by General MacArthur himself, who apparently considered its release desirable in the interests of the war effort. In other words, the General felt the home front needed to know what was going on at the battlefront. His authorisation had also, interestingly, broken a ban in the US, and the publication of the story in Australia had been condemned by Washington in the strongest terms. Perhaps the apotheosis of grimness faced by the censors were the allegations of Japanese military having engaged in cannibalism and dismemberment of human bodies. For literary buffs, it may well be worth noting that just as Johnston was reporting on Japanese atrocities, so too was poet Kenneth Slessor, who had written a story about 2 severed heads of European women having been found in boxes with Japanese characters written on them. This story was banned. Further stories about Japanese soldiers eating other Japanese soldiers were also submitted, and furious debate took place within the government over whether or not their publication was justified. Finally, Evatt, in his capacity as Attorney General, recommended to Prime Minister Curtin that the stories be quashed. He wrote, "While there is much to be said for telling the public the truth about Japanese atrocities, I feel that we should avoid distressing relatives over the purely gruesome," and he consigned the stories to be investigated fully by Webb. Almost a year later, however, the official line had altered in response to changes in how other Allied countries were managing reportage of atrocity stories in general. Part of this was the fact that the stories about the German concentration camps had been given worldwide publicity. The spectre of Great War atrocity propaganda had finally been exorcised, and the filmed evidence of German atrocities against Jews was now compelling enough for it to receive the full support of US and British publicity arms. The capacity to believe again in the possibility of acts of great human evil had been restored, and this impacted on the willingness to believe stories about the Japanese as well as the Germans. Another reason relating directly to Australia was that General Blamey and the Australian Army Public Relations arm had authenticated the cannibalism stories. Bonney, he's the chief censor, calling these horror stories affecting Australian troops, regretted the impact on relatives, but felt that given high policy regarding atrocities in other countries had changed, it was time to allow such material to be published. As the stories were being published in the United States already, there was actually little reason to prevent their reproduction in Australia. Of course, the wire services were very efficient. So published they were with the inevitable lurid and unpleasant headlines. In June 1945, the Commander-in-Chief had come to the decision that not all horror stories affecting Australian troops should be banned. Indeed, he believed the effect on Australian troops, generally of such occurrences, is not one of demoralisation, but induces in them an even greater determination in the discharge of their duties. He recommended the blanket ban on atrocities be lifted from this point. So even material about mistreatment of Australian POWs, which had been passed by field censorship and coming from Borneo, were now being published. In response to the flood of stories that were now being released, the Returned Soldiers and Airmen's Imperial League of Australia wrote to Prime Minister Ben Chifley of the nervous collapse suffered by the women folk at the news of the treatment of Australian POWs. They asked, given the stories could not alter in the slightest the terms of peace, what good purpose can possibly be achieved by such headlines at present being resorted to by the press? Dr. Greta Hort of the University Women's College asked, even if it was impossible to stop the publication of atrocity stories, could they not be prevented from splashing these stories on front page, back page, and every page with pictures and fat headlines? Thus, by the end of the war, the media had at least returned full circle back to the constant publication of stories about the brutality of the enemy, written very much in the style of Great War reportage on German atrocities. The previously effective censorship from below, from affected relatives and those who were sensitive to their feelings, was no longer an active force. An official campaign, however, never eventuated. The Australians, I would argue, made a wise decision when they held back the Webb report until the end of the war and did not allow the material to be used as war propaganda. This decision arguably was one of the reasons there was no coordinated Allied campaign about POWs in Japanese camps. There were, of course, other reasons too. Firstly, there was concern that an atrocity propaganda campaign about POWs would result in reprisals against Australian and Allied soldiers. Secondly, the inter-Allied nature of publicity campaigns created an environment of bureaucratic inertia and confusion, with the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the Netherlands and Great Britain failing to come to an agreement regarding a campaign about POW camps. And one country could not release a campaign without the permission of all of the other countries with POWs in Japanese camps, as there was fear the atrocity campaign would bring retribution on the prisoners, either through the withholding of relief packages or through direct violence. There was also, of course, the question about how a propaganda campaign might affect morale. Would it stir people up to fight, or would it lead to defeatism? The driver behind an attempted joint atrocity propaganda campaign was the British government. They rather optimistically wrote in late October 1943 that a campaign with calculated disclosures could be launched in 2 or 3 months' time, with a coordinated policy between the US, the Dominions and the Netherlands government. In the 1943 War Cabinet notes, the British could see little purpose behind continued silence and believed that the distress caused to the relatives of an atrocity campaign would be the stiffening of the nation's will to pursue the war with Japan up to the complete and final defeat of the Japanese. After all, stated one communique, even in the absence of publicity, the Japanese have gone to extremes of barbarity that in some areas at least, publicity could not have made worse. However, despite the shared deep concern about the well-being of Allied POWs, an inter-Allied agreement was not easy to come by, and the primary issue was finding a straightforward path between publicising atrocities and simultaneously protecting the POWs. There was evidence that negative publicity had, for example, led the Japanese to deliberately block the delivery of external relief in the form of food, medicines and other comforts. Communications amongst the Allies about the effect of publicity on the Japanese were conflicting. Some reported a greater openness and a possible willingness to open the camps up finally to the International Red Cross. Other communications intimated that pressure on the Japanese was counterproductive. The Swiss view, which was broadcast by the British to the Allies, stated that these campaigns were deeply unhelpful, with the Swiss minister reporting in 1944, and I quote, that the Japanese government have repeatedly informed him that Anglo-American statements about ill treatment of prisoners of war were inopportune and had only caused delay in the solution of various problems. At a personal interview with the Swiss minister on the 11th of March, the Japanese Minister for Foreign Affairs said statements had greatly irritated the Japanese military and naval authorities, whom he was endeavouring to calm down. The Swiss minister also stated that Japan would leave nothing undone, again, to win the war and would consequently do nothing against her military interests. So there's a number of different conflicting aims that were underlying the purpose of this campaign. As Sir John Lambert of the British Foreign Office astutely observed to the War Office, there were 3 conflicting goals in relation to dealing with the Japanese through a publicity campaign. These goals: 1, to improve the treatment for prisoners; 2, to explain why the Allies have been unable to assist the POWs; and 3, finally, to stimulate war-mindedness against Japan, made for a 3-legged stool that was not a particularly stable one. And there was just very little agreement amongst the Allies. Australia, for example, opposed a campaign on the grounds that adequate publicity had already been given to the Japanese failure to observe international obligations in respect to POWs. In addition, Bonny, who I've mentioned before and who is now the head of the Department of Information by this point, felt that the greatest caution should be used in case the Japanese responded with reprisals against the prisoners. Finally, he stated, there is little reliable information held in Australia regarding Japanese atrocities which could be used in the proposed campaign. On the 3rd of February 1944, however, it appears that the Japanese had started to sniff out the existence of the Webb report, with the High Commissioner's Office passing on the polite request to transmit copies of any reports bearing on ill treatment of Allied prisoners. The War Office gives assurances they would not make any use of such material referring to Australian prisoners without the prior agreement. Australia duly provided a précis of the early findings of the Webb report on 30th of May 1944. It seems perhaps something might happen. However, this was of little use to the British because the US had now changed their minds. Previously supportive of a campaign and believing it could provide leverage to improve the conditions of POWs, the State Department decided in June 1944 that in the immediate future, at all events, no further publicity should be given to Japanese atrocities. If later it is desired to issue further statements, they should, in the State Department's view, be carefully coordinated with statements of negotiations with and protests to the Japanese concerning treatment of prisoners and internees. In other words, again, how can this information be used to help the POWs? Given the importance of the Webb report as one of the key legal war crimes investigations, it's also interesting that the US decided that the Webb report should not be published at this point. It was not until September 1945 that the Webb report, which could have become a pillar of war propaganda but instead was destined to support the prosecution of war crimes, was released. Evatt wrote to the War Cabinet regarding the release of the Webb report, saying, "It seems to be reasonably clear that the possibility of any reprisals by the enemy is remote. If we delay any further, the value of the report will be much lessened." As predicted, the reporting was tawdry and distress was caused to relatives who did not know the fate of their relatives. But a new phase in the story of how the information bureaucracy treated the POWs had begun, and that was to pursue a publicity campaign to press for the prosecution of Japanese war criminals in the international courts. The quiet war of censorship and caution had been exchanged for an open warfare of a post-war atrocity propaganda campaign. So just summing up, are there lessons for the present? Despite the great distance of time between now and World War II, I would suggest that similar dynamics might appear again if we were to embark on a major war. Despite reduced warning time, the loss of geography is a key part of Australian defence due to things like hypersonics and the dominance of digital information warfare, there are factors that will probably remain the same as those in the Second World War. We will most likely continue to have interoperability with the United States and other allies. We will still have the inevitable clashes between states and federal governments over coordination of information, and doubtless civilian censors and publicists still have different views from military censors on how propaganda material from the battle should be deployed. Finally, perhaps most importantly, the moral problem of violence, and atrocities in particular, remains as problematic as it did in the Second World War. How we respond to violence and what kind of force we believe is morally acceptable to use against the enemy are not issues that have really been resolved, despite the sophisticated nature of international humanitarian law. In addition, it is inevitable that breaches of the laws of armed conflict will continue to be used in propaganda, both to discredit the enemy and to manage morale. I believe the complex nature of communication between the Allies over the issue of atrocities and the strategic implication of how these atrocities were handled through propaganda and censorship in World War II, a topic which I've only just scraped the surface of in this talk, is an area worth deeper investigation, as it will have salient lessons for any future war Australia participates in. Thank you.